So what the heck is a question barista anyways? Well, I'll tell you, one of the things that your customers hate most about your discovery motion is when we sometimes bombard them with questions from our polite interrogation menu, right? We have good questions like, what's your budget? What keeps you up at night? Like, what does your approval process look like? These aren't bad questions, but the problem is we just execute these questions as though they were the next questions off our list, creating no emotional connection or interest or engagement from the customer to answer them. But we can change that by being these question baristas. Take the questions that we're already asking and convert them into these artisan handcrafted questions that were crafted specifically for our customers. It's going to make them more engaged and want to answer them. That's what we're going to talk about today. Welcome to another episode of Sales Lab Live. I'm David Premer, and this is a great topic because I actually spend in my discovery training course, I actually spend my time doing two things, right? Number one is we talk about what do we want to know going into these discovery conversations? Like, what are some of the things when we get into a discovery conversation, and it kind of sounds a little counterintuitive, what do we want to talk about? Okay, so we spend a bunch of time talking about that, and we go into things like the unknown, unspoken. You can check out my YouTube channel. I have tons of content on this. But like, what is it that you want to know? Topics that are really going to be interesting and engaging to your customer, things that they can't learn about or wouldn't talk about with a normal sales rep, except for someone who is very kind, empathetic, and very insightful. That's bucket number one. Bucket number two is, how do you get people to tell you things, right? Because when you think about discovery, we're asking people very intimate details about their business and their pains and their problems. And my view is, why would they tell you anything? Right? To some extent, you're a stranger. You have no credibility. You have no trust, right? But there is a lot to be made in how we actually ask those questions, right? So it's not just the questions themselves, but how we ask them. So I spend a lot of time, actually the majority of the time in my discovery training with my clients, talking about how to ask questions in a way that get people to answer them. And this is going to be one of the kind of the more cerebral tactics that we cover. And this is actually something that, oftentimes we're not very conscious, right, of like how we ask our questions, because we come into our conversations, we come all prepared, we have a list of things we need to get done, information we need to extract. And this is especially true of younger sellers, right? Because younger sellers were like, well, look, someone gave me these list of questions. I need to go and, prosecute this customer and I get them to answer it. And it is not, it's not that simple, because in the back of their head, they're thinking, who the hell is this person, right? And why would I tell them anything? So that's what we're going to talk about today. Let me cue up so we got our slides here. That's what we're going to talk about today. I call this being a question barista, right? Like, how do you craft your questions? I wish this episode was sponsored by Starbucks. It is not, but if you're a Starbucks executive, give me a shout. Maybe we can work something out. But how do we become a question barista? Meaning, how do we craft questions that are like artisan-created, handcrafted, specifically for our customers to make them feel that this was not the next question on our list, but something specifically that we had handcrafted for them. So I'm going to give you three tactics today. I think I've done a pretty good job of kind of laying out the problem. How do we get people to answer our questions? So I'm going to give you three tactics that you can use, and you can just take the questions that you've already been asking, layer these three tactics into them. In fact, you should layer these three tactics all together to produce an outcome of a question that is much more engaging that your customers will actually want to answer. So the first tactic we're going to talk about is this idea of referencing something that they said earlier in the conversation before you ask your question, right? So for example, if you're asking, like, what's your budget, right? You might say, well, so earlier in the conversation, you said you actually had a number of projects already on the go, project A, B, and C. So I imagine, some of that, there's budget that's being eaten up by some of those projects. So I'm curious, like, what would be the budget for this particular project, right? Or so I'm referencing the budget conversations, the projects they had earlier. Or I might reference their pain. I might say, hey, look, you mentioned earlier that, this problem has been going on for some time, and, it seems to be costing you about anywhere between $10,000 to $12,000 a month. Just out of curiosity, like, what budget did you have to kind of solve this problem, right? And the nice thing here is that a number of things. Number one, like, you should be taking notes in your customer conversations. The fact that you're recounting something earlier that they mentioned does two things. Number one, it shows them that you were listening, right? You were taking notes. And in fact, here's like a little bonus point for you. If you say, I'm just looking back at my notes, what I wrote down earlier was you said this. if you actually reference something specifically that they said and basically prove to them that you wrote it down, not only does it it makes it seem like you were listening, but of course, like there's an element of reciprocity at play here, right? When we listen to people, it makes them more receptive to listen to us and answer our questions. It's like a little gift that you're giving them, saying like, I was paying attention this whole time. Right? And the other piece is it can let you moderate your question a little bit, right? Like it's a nice lead in. It feels very organic. It doesn't make you feel like it was always the next question on my list. You're asking it because of something they said earlier that kind of sparked your curiosity and interest. So whenever you can, always reference something someone said earlier in the conversation before you ask your question to lend context to it. So that is my tip number 1. Tip number 2 is I say slow down. Slow down, right? And it's kind of funny to say, but I'll give you an example. One of the tactics I absolutely love, and I have content about this all over the place, is my 1 to 10 discovery question tactic. And this is very simple, right? If I'm asking a customer about something, like let's say the priority to get a project off the ground, I might say, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Customer, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being super high priority, 1 being like, this isn't even on your radar. Like, where would you say this sits, right? You can use this like 1 to 10 question all over the show. I don't have time to get into a whole 1 to 10 question training here. However, when I read it to you like that, like imagine I was just like reading, again, my polite interrogation menu to you, saying, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being super high priority, 1 being low priority, where would you say this is? Like, to me, when you ask questions like that, I may as well have just given like a clipboard to the customer with like a pen on it and say, can you just fill this out for me? There's no interest, there's no intrigue, there's no sense that I'm crafting these questions explicitly for you. And so one of the ways that we can send the message to our customer that we are crafting these questions specifically for them is to slow down. And not just slow down our pace of speech, because obviously our pace of speech will influence, how they interpret the question, but almost think of it like this. Almost like this. You weren't planning to ask the customer this question, but they said something, it sparked your curiosity, sparked your interest, and now you're crafting this question in your head on the fly as you're asking it to your customer. And I'll give you an example. And this is actually something when I do a lot of call reviews with my clients. So I do a lot of call coaching and I will watch their calls. A lot of them will use like a gong or a chorus or a tool that lets them, record their calls, not just the audio, but visually as well. And I'll see from time to time questions where a rep will ask a customer a question and they'll kind of like, kind of scratch their chin. They'll kind of look around. So, like on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being, this is super important, and 1 being, hey, look, this is not even on our radar. Like, where would you say this is for you? Now, look, I'm doing a little bit of acting here, but the idea of like looking around the room, right, is an interesting one. One of the reasons why, and this is getting into a little bit of science here for you, one of the reasons why people look around the room instead of directly at you is because they're trying to process something mentally in their head, right? Like they have a question they're trying to formulate. And what happens is when I'm looking at you, there's too much visual information coming my way, right? It's actually why speakers, if you're giving like a talk in front of a large audience, it's why a lot of speakers will kind of like scan the room instead of laser focusing on one person. It's because they have all this content in their head and they know that if they focus on one person, which is actually what you're supposed to do, but that's a whole other Sales Lab Live. If you're focused on one person, you're going to lose your train of thought. And so what do? They look up to the ceiling, they look off to the side to do one thing, to remove the visual information coming from their eyes so they can focus on the question that they're crafting. And I'll see a lot of sales reps do this subconsciously, accidentally, and I'll actually call it out and I'll say, that's good. Because when you're looking around the room and you're saying, so I guess like, if I'm you, like, how would you think about allocating budget to this kind of thing? Like, you see, when I ask it like that, it makes you feel like I was crafting this question on the fly just for you as the information you previously provided to me was being processed, right? So that is my, it's all wrapped up in this tip number 2, which is slow down. But slowing down deliberately, thinking deliberately, looking off, being thoughtful about how you ask your question can have a massive impact on your customer's desire to answer it. So when in doubt, I say, number 2, slow down. Now, the third tip is, again, this is actually like a really, really simple one, very almost simple, similar to the first one, right? And all you're going to do here is preface your question with a phrase like, I'm curious, or just out of curiosity, right? And so again, like when you say like, I'm curious, or just out of curiosity, like here's what it says when you use that phrase. It says, I wasn't going to ask this question, but something that you said earlier, right, which hopefully I've written down and recounted to you as I asked this question, something you said to me earlier piqued my curiosity. And I wasn't going to ask this, but now I am, because of something you said, which means that I've been listening to you, that the gears have been turning, and I'm creating this question, this narrative, and this discovery conversation. I'm doing this just for you. I don't do this with everyone, right? So saying just out of curiosity. So like think about these three things, right? If you put them all together, right? So you're going to reference something they said something earlier in the conversation. You're going to slow down and craft the question specifically for them. And number three, you're going to add the I'm curious. So you can say something like, hey, look, David, just out of curiosity, like earlier in the conversation, you mentioned that you had a whole bunch of projects on the go in your organization. And I totally get that. A lot of organizations have a lot of things on the go, especially nowadays. I'm curious, like where this sits, right, on the priority for you. Because like, again, if I'm you in your organization, you can't do everything. Like, and by the way, like I would want you to have this be a priority for your organization. If you're going to take it on, I want you to put the organizational horsepower behind it. I want you to, I want you to be successful with it. So out of curiosity, like on a scale of, let's say 1 to 10, right? And 10 being, this is super high on the priority list, the most important thing that we would do compared to all the other things we have going. And 1 being, hey, look, it's not so important. Like, where would this be for you, right? And you see here, like, again, I'm looping these three things together. I'm curious, just out of curiosity. I'm crafting the question on the fly. I'm looping in some information you provided to me earlier in the conversation. That is how you craft questions that make the customers engaged and want to answer. Because now all of a sudden, this is not a polite interrogation. This is a conversation that we're having between two human beings, right? So that's it. That's all I got for you today. That's what it's all about, being a question barista. Just, again, slow down, be mindful, reference something they said earlier in the conversation, and you're going to see, like, good things are going to happen. Good things are going to happen. People are going to want to answer your discovery calls. So that's all I got for you today on Sales Lab Live. I hope you have a great rest of your day.